Hi guys, I'm Lauren, and the title of my talk is When the Music Changes, So Does the Dance. So now you guys have heard about all the different jobs that proteins can have, and also what happens when proteins get stuck together. But I'm going to be telling you about what happens when proteins travel really far away from where they're made in your body to do their signature dance moves. So proteins that do this are called hormones. Hormones travel really far away from their source in your body to be able to do their dance moves. So we'll be talking all about this today, and I'll also be focusing on an example of an important hormone in your body that I think is pretty interesting and good to know about. So let's illustrate this. So some proteins do their jobs like this, meaning they do a stationary dance. But hormones do their jobs like this, meaning they move a lot to do their jobs. So now that we've illustrated that, let's talk about some examples that you might know about. So I bet you all know testosterone, and you probably know estrogen. But you may or may not know about the example I'll be focusing on today, and that's a hormone called ghrelin. So ghrelin is a really talented molecule. It has a lot of different dance moves. So in healthy people, ghrelin makes you feel hungry, which is a good thing, because we all need to eat, right? But ghrelin may also explain why people feel sad and scared. And we'll be focusing on all of this today. So we've now talked about what is a hormone, and now we'll be moving on to focusing exclusively on an example. So I wanted to show you, this is what ghrelin looks like if we look at it from a molecular perspective in space. So Emma told you guys that proteins fold in different ways, so this is what ghrelin looks like. And from here on out, I'll use this little green triangle to represent ghrelin in diagrams, just to make things a little easier. So let's just review the concept of a receptor. So you guys heard about this earlier. But just to refresh your memory, so a receptor is itself a type of protein that cells put on their surfaces to catch things that are floating around in your body. So remember, ghrelin is a hormone, so it's floating around in your bloodstream. So the receptor catches ghrelin when it's floating around, and this is how ghrelin can send its messages to the organs of your body. Just keep this in mind. This is how ghrelin does its dance moves. So let's start with how ghrelin makes you feel hungry. So this starts when your stomach is empty. It's been a few hours since you had anything to eat. So see the green triangle? You can see that your stomach is starting to make ghrelin. But for ghrelin to actually have its effects, watch what happens. It has to travel throughout your bloodstream, all the way to your brain. And here, it uses its receptor in an area of your brain that's your body's hunger center to be able to do its main dance move, which is to make you feel hungry. And so now you realize you're hungry, and you go to find food. And then once you're satisfied, ghrelin disappears in your body again until you need to have another meal. But remember I said that ghrelin is a really talented molecule that has a lot of different dance moves. And the title of my talk is When the Music Changes, So Does the Dance. So ghrelin may also explain why people feel like this and also like this. So we've all, I'm sure, felt sad and scared at times. And we might have friends, family, or loved ones who have felt really, really sick because of these emotions. And this is what we call mental illness. So unfortunately, mental illness is very common in our society. It affects tens of millions of people every single year. So I'm going to be focusing on two specific examples, depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, that ghrelin may actually help us explain and better treat. So what is depression? Well, people who have depression get a lot of symptoms like extreme sadness, a lot of anxiety, feelings of hopelessness, fatigue, and trouble focusing. And they get these symptoms all day, every day, for periods of weeks at a time. Unfortunately, depression is pretty common in our society. It affects about 7% of adults in the United States every single year. So the trouble is our brains are really complicated, and scientists don't always understand them super well, and they're looking for better ways to understand them so that we can treat things like depression. So I'll be telling you about how ghrelin may help us explain depression. But you're probably saying, you told me ghrelin is a good thing. It makes me feel hungry. And that is true, but see the green triangle, watch what happens in depression. There's too much ghrelin, and too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. Okay, so keep that in mind. So this is what happens when there's too much ghrelin. So all that ghrelin travels through your bloodstream to the brain, and ghrelin takes on new dance moves. Okay, so not just in your body's hunger center, but in areas of your brain that can make people feel stronger emotions. So too much of a good thing is a bad thing in depression. So I also said we'd talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But first, let's talk about, well, what even is stress? So I bet you guys have all experienced stress, whether you were thinking a lot about paying your next bill, or maybe you had a big exam, or maybe there was some soccer game that you were thinking a lot about. So in all of these cases, you probably felt something like a fluttering in your chest, or maybe you were sweating a lot. In all of these cases, this is actually stress. So stress is your body's response to a stressful event. And in the short term, it's a good thing because it prepares you to handle challenges, kind of like the successful guy on the right. Because think about it, if you needed to think fast during an exam, you would want a rush of energy. But the trouble is, if you have too much stress, either at one time or over time, the systems of your body can start to give out. And unfortunately, some people do have this amount of stress. For example, if day in and day out, they're worrying about paying their bills. And this is what we call chronic stress. So the trouble is, chronic stress can lead to illnesses like PTSD. So what is PTSD? Well, PTSD means you form strong, fearful memories of traumatic events. Unfortunately, this is a pretty salient illness in our society. It affects about 10 to 20% of veterans of the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But we don't just worry about PTSD in veterans. For example, 16% of children who are exposed to traumatic events can get PTSD. So, although this is clearly a public health issue, the problem is we don't really have effective ways of treating it. So a lot of scientists think that the key to understanding and treating PTSD is to really understand how chronic stress increases our risk of getting it. So I'll next be telling you about how ghrelin may actually help us do that. So sometimes in the lab, we can use animals to make models of human disease. So scientists did this to study ghrelin. They gave one group of rats something stressful, kind of like you taking an exam. And then they had another group of rats that was like a comparison. They kind of just let them hang out as if they were playing on the playground. They gave both of these groups of rats something that might be shocking to them, and they looked at how much they remembered from this experience. And they found that the animals that had the stressful event showed higher levels of ghrelin and were more fearful. Okay, so just like in depression, too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. So ghrelin starts to take on multiple dance moves in the stressed animals, not just in your body's hunger center, but also in those areas of the brain that can make people feel stronger emotions. So again, the name of the game is too much of a good thing is a bad thing. So because a lot of this research is pretty new, we don't really know how many people are sick because of their ghrelin. And we also don't know if they do have any changes in their ghrelin, if they're hungrier because of this. But hopefully we'll be able to answer these questions in the future. And the really important thing is how we can use these findings clinically. So for example, did you guys know that there are already drugs out there that we can use to change people's ghrelin levels, kind of like using a dimmer for your ghrelin? So we know that these are safe to use in humans, but we don't yet know how exactly to use them. What we do know is that if you do an experiment, kind of like what I told you, the before, and you have a group of rats that you give stress to, and then you show them something shocking and you look at how much they remembered from this experience, they aren't sick if you give them the drug as well. So their ghrelin levels are normal and they're not fearful. So this drug makes these animals less sick, and hopefully it will do the same for humans. So the next step would of course be to test these drugs in this context in humans. And if they do work in this context, then we'd be looking at questions like how much of them to give and when to give them. For example, after stress or after fear. These would be things we'd be thinking about. So in conclusion, we talked a lot about what is a hormone. So a hormone is a special type of protein that travels far away from its source in your body to be able to do its dance moves. And it uses its receptor to do so. And remember, its receptor is itself a type of protein. And then we talked all about an example of an important hormone called ghrelin. So remember, ghrelin is really talented. It has a lot of different dance moves. So in healthy people, when it's doing its job, it makes you feel hungry, which is a good thing. But it can also explain why some people feel really, really sad and scared. So as I've said, our brains are super complicated, and scientists are always looking at different ways to better understand the brain so that we can treat things like mental illness. So we hope that research along these lines can really help to develop better treatments for people who are suffering. So let's sum up everything we've talked about today. So Emma taught you guys that proteins are really the major workhorse of our cells. And then Adriana and I talked more about the jobs that proteins can have. And we also talked about how when these proteins go awry, they can possibly make us sick. So specifically, we learned that proteins are macromolecules, and they have specific functions, which are their signature dance moves. We learned that proteins can act locally, meaning within your cells, and also distantly, meaning far away in your body. So proteins are really everywhere. We learned about misfolded proteins that can't do their signature dance moves, and how this can potentially cause diseases like Alzheimer's. So specifically, there are two proteins that we think are involved in this disease, tau and amyloid beta. And Adriana taught us all about how if we better understand these proteins, we might be able to better diagnose and treat things like Alzheimer's. And then finally, I hope that I taught you that our brains are really complicated and we don't really understand them too well. And this is really the key to treating things like mental illness. And I hope that I was able to introduce you guys to a new research area, which is ghrelin, which we may be able to use down the line to develop new medicines for people who are really suffering. So we thank you very much for a wonderful 2019 season, and we really hope to see you next year. So, thank you.